Bye.
Good evening. I'm Steve Courtney from the Mark Twain House and Museum, and this is the Trouble at Home review having to do with matters Twainian. Tonight we have with us Dr. Miki Pfeffer, who is a wonderful author and editor who I'll be telling you about in a minute. But first, let me run through a couple of things. One is, of course, although this is a free program, as we always say, it's not free to produce. And we are lucky enough to have the support of Connecticut Humanities with a wonderful new grant. We have also enjoyed over the last few years the support of the Center for Mark Twain Studies at Elmira College in Elmira, New York. So we have those people helping us, and you too can help if you want to join this august company. If you see this sort of turquoise line below me, you can click that at any time if you think that this is worth something, or if you want to think of what an admission to an event like this might be. Just click there and they will tell you what to do. In the course of the program, you may have questions come to mind, in which case, please don't put them into the chat because they might get a little lost among all the paeans of praise and so on that you'll find over there. But you'll see down under that turquoise line, there's something that says ask a question. So click there, write in your question. Jennifer LaRue, who is sort of the presiding genius behind the scenes here, will then sort of register the question. At the very end, we will call Jennifer back onto the scene. She was with us a few moments ago, and she will then go through the questions, and we'll answer them as best we can. So let me start with a story. All right, it was just before Christmas in the year 2015. I got this letter at the Mark Twain House. Hello. I am transcribing the letters of New Orleans writer Grace King, whose mentor was Charles Dudley Warner, and whose friends were the Clemenses through introductions by Warner when she visited Hartford in 1887. Of course, the Clemens family was the family of Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, his wife and daughters. I am trying to put together a presentation on letters between King and Warner, but his handwriting is, and now this is in all caps, indecipherable. I was charmed to get this letter, partly because Charles Dudley Warner was the neighbor of Mark Twain, a collaborator with him. He was a newspaper collaborator with him on The Gilded Age, his first novel, a newspaper editor in town. In his obituary in 1900, they actually noted that one of the printers or typesetters went off and joined the army and went to the Civil War because he could no longer read Warner's handwriting. As Miki had a hard time doing, as I had a hard time doing. But I was even more charmed because Grace King, we knew her at the Mark Twain House as a Southern writer who had beautifully described some of the aspects of the house, who had wonderfully described a particular dinner at the Clemenses in 1887. And then that's sort of about all we knew of her till I came across some old essays and things in a file in our library by a man named Robert Bush. Now, Bush went on to become the biographer of King. In a nutshell, and we'll hear a lot more about this soon, she was a Southern writer on regional topics, generally having to do with New Orleans or Louisiana. She later went on to become a historian, but she made a connection with all these New England writers. And of course, by then, Mark Twain, even though from Missouri, was a New England writer living in Hartford for 20 years. So, and Miki when she contacted us, she had already produced a wonderful book called Southern Ladies and Suffragists, which was a story from the New Orleans World's Fair of 1884, in which the Northerners and Southerners again sort of came together in an odd mesh. And so Miki, where did you find Grace King in all this?
I found her letters at LSU in Grace King papers. I was looking for firsthand.
Louisiana
State University in Baton Rouge. I was looking for firsthand accounts of women who might have attended the women's department at the Cotton Centennial Exposition in 1884-85, and I came across her letters, and they were so snarky and gossipy that I thought, oh, this woman knows everything and everyone. She was nattering from the sidelines. She wasn't a full participant she didn't do the work in the women's department. She visited and nattered from the sidelines. So when that book was over, I thought, who would I like to know more about? And I remembered Grace King's letters. So I just started transcribing them in part for my own pleasure and enjoyment and edification, being from New Orleans myself and knowing various names. And it grew into this discovery of a cache of Mark Twain letters. But Robert Bush, Clemens letters from her to them and from the girls to her, and Livy especially, and Sam Clemens. Fewer letters, but delicious ones.
And Miki, by the way, is joining us from Thibodaux, which is a town about, it's southwest of New Orleans, and which I had, and my wife had the privilege of visiting last year so that we could do something roughly like this at the Louisiana Book Festival. So 2015, she was still transcribing crazily over the next few years. We kept up a correspondence, and here is the result. This is a New Orleans author in Mark Twain's court, letters from New England, from Grace King's New England Sojourns. And this, in this, you get the whole story, and you get this wonderful story of a Southern writer coming north, and the friendships and connections that she made. And the reviewer in the Mark Twain forum said it was a page turner. He said, it's not, you normally don't expect a novel when you're picking up a book of somebody's letters, even if they're a very good and authoritative collection of letters. But here you do, and it's partly, and it's, so give us an example of some of the wonderful things she said. I have a few, but you do it in your own way.
Well, she was very interested in observing the character of the New Englanders, especially the Hartfordians, Hartford people. And she made various comments like people there knew literary figures and knew names of books, but she didn't think they were readers very much. And when she went to Cooperstown on a visit, she said those people only, she was sure, read one book, The Deerslayer. And she made various comments like, these people here look like they're assured of salvation. They have a satisfied look on their face, and I'm so close to damnation that I feel unease and déclassé. She found herself being an observer and a commentator, and that's what she was. She was disturbed that people didn't brew over anything but vegetables and flowers. She thought that what self-control they had, especially when she went to the churches at Olana.
That's right.
Some of the things she said.
Well, let's back up now. What specifically got her up north among all these Hartford New Englanders? I think one of those quotes I part of one that you recited. The Hartfordians have the contented expression of faith and speech of souls, assured of salvation in the next life and prosperity in this.
Yes.
But anyway, but what brought her up here?
Well, Charles Dudley Warner invited her. He kind of discovered her in New Orleans at the Cotton Centennial. She was not a writer at the time of the Cotton Centennial. Maybe she was a wannabe, but she hadn't written anything. And Warner and Richard Watson Gilder both had come to New Orleans to find new writers and to write up the World's Fair on their own and what was happening in the South in the 80s. And she made a friend of Charles Dudley Warner, and he helped her get her first story published. She said that Gilder inspired or challenged her to write against George Washington Cable's stories, which she and the local population didn't appreciate the way he presented the especially the Creoles. So Gilda, she said, challenged her to write her first story, and Warner helped her get it placed in the New Princeton Review, in the first issue of that. So she kept up a correspondence with Warner, and he went to New Orleans several times, and always the Kings would invite people to come to their house. Her mother was a raconteuse and a very fine cook. So they were always, their house was open to visitors. And so Warner, in return, invited her to come in 1887 and stay with him. Actually, his wife issued the invitation, but I'm sure at his urging. And so she came to Hartford in June of 1887 and stayed till early November, not always at the Warners. She moved around. She stayed in an inn. She boarded at an inn in Farmington. She went off to Cooperstown. She went off to Watch Hill in Rhode Island, but most of the time she spent in and around Hartford. So she got to meet the Clemenses almost right away because they lived next door. And the Warners and the Clemenses were good friends. So.
And that was when she had the famous dinner that she described so elegantly.
Right. Which you love to repeat. She talks about all the food, but she was as interested in the tabletop as she was in the food. She talked about what the centerpiece was like. She talked about each person having a little bunch of white roses next to the plate. And while other people were talking, she said she looked around the dining room and she described this odd piece of furniture, and it's still there. I discovered when I visited Mark Twain House, that spinet that's made into a china cabinet, a crystal cabinet, which I think is hysterical. They took the strings out and replaced the strings with shelves and put a glass front on the upright piano and made it into a crystal cabinet.
And as you mentioned Olana before. This was the house in the Hudson Valley where the artist Frederick Church lived, who was originally from Hartford. She traveled with a whole, was that on the same trip that she made this, that they made the journey to Olana, or was that a later one?
No, this was almost immediately after she got there in June. The Warners, the Clemenses, and she took a train to Olana. And immediately when the women got in, they wanted to open the windows because it was too hot. And she said Twain grumbled that if women were in hell, the first thing they'd want to do would be to open the windows. He grumbled about that. And while they were at Olana, they were there for several days. Twitchell, your guy Twitchell, joined them there, Reverend Twitchell. But just the five of them had traveled up to Olana. But while they were there, the Warners got word that one of their friends had died. So they went immediately from Olana to wherever this friend was. And so Grace King was left to come back from Olana with the Clemenses. And that's when she felt she had gotten intimate with them because it was just the three of them. And they had more time to get acquainted in their own way without the Warners there.
So that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship, so to speak.
Right, right. And shortly after that, the horse was sick, and Livy couldn't take the carriage to church, and she obviously, being in delicate health, couldn't walk to church apparently. So Grace went to church with the daughters. She describes that in one of the letters, and so she got close to the daughters as well. They were 15, 13, and 7 at that time.
And that was, of course, Susie, Clara, and Jean.
Right.
And so, a good deal of the correspondence in your book is the Clemens's letters back to her, as you mentioned.
Right.
And then, the ones from the daughters when they were little are really extremely charming. They must have looked up to her as somebody special.
Right. In fact, Susie called her ideal. Apparently, she had perfectionist tendencies. She felt she could never live up to her ideal. Grace King is her ideal, or whatever they talked about as ideal characteristics. She said she didn't have the character for it. She wanted to just be a slug.
But and I could see, though, that for a young woman, Grace King would be a bit of an ideal, because she was fiercely independent woman who perpetually had money problems and was supporting and helping a whole family, not all of whose members were all that functional, correct? There was a brother who was...
Well, she was not supporting them, really. She always made just hundreds, she said. She didn't make thousands like Mark Twain did. She could support herself in a way, but she couldn't buy a house or, she was just managing to travel, to buy clothes, maybe to treat one of her family members on occasion, to buy some souvenirs, but she never made a lot of money. And they had lost everything in the Civil War, so they were impoverished. The genteel poverty, genteel poor. Her father had died in 1881. That left her mother and 7 children. Grace was the oldest of 4 daughters, and she had 3 brothers, 2 older than she and 1 younger.
And a lot of the correspondence is particularly with one of her sisters and with her mother.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Only one of the daughters married, and she moved to Charlotte. So that's why there are so many letters telling so many intimate details, because this was her closest sister, and she wrote all the details of the family life to May, who lived in Charlotte the rest of her life once she was married in 1884. The rest of the daughters did not marry.
And the other thing that I could see it might have appealed to Susie was that Grace was a writer, and she was
right.
getting herself published and fighting with. There's a wonderful line where she's some publisher has kept her waiting, and she says, "I find myself sitting here waiting on a whole bunch of men, and it makes me furious."
Right. Right. Yeah,
And
that was when she returned to New York from a European trip in 1904, 05. Yeah,
so
oh
well,
five.
so after that 1887 visit, the friendship with the Clemenses and the Warners developed and deepened, and there were all sorts of side plots that you can read in the book. But in general, uh, she got quite close to Livy, you mentioned.
Very close, yes. Livy wrote her and said, I found a friend. I love you and I trust you. And that was really important. Sometimes I think that when a person is from another place, it's easier to reveal yourself to that person because you're not seeing them every day. They're not in your set. They don't have expectations of you. And I think that I read recently Samuel Clemens in Hannibal by Dixon Wechter. And the more I read, the more I realized how much Twain and Grace King had in common. They were both from river cities. They had inspiring mothers and creative mothers, and um, they both struggled. They both took on family troubles, perhaps more burdens than they needed to. And just knowing the river, just being close to the river is a very intimate thing. And I think that they just felt they had a common bond. And because Livy loved Sam Clemens and those aspects about him, I think Grace King she had an easy in, and she loved Livy and the girls. So Twain loved her for loving Livy and the girls, I think. This is my speculation, why that friendship worked.
And what tell us a little bit about her writing. What the story that first appeared that sort of made her name was Monsieur Mott. Is that
Right,
it? And
right.
this was sort of a I think of when I've read a few of her stories, and they remind me a little bit of Ambrose Bierce. They always have a twisted, unexpected ending. Um, the ones I read, then she wrote, of course, completely different things about New Orleans history and the Battle of New Orleans and so on.
Right.
But how would you characterize what she produced as literature?
Well, her collection of short stories was called Balcony Stories, and it was appropriate. This is it here.
Ah,
That's her mother's copy. Her mother's name is in here. I brought that from the estate sale. And she dedicated it to her mother because she said they would sit on the balcony and tell these stories. She felt that she was telling stories out of her life and the life of people she knew. It was not, um, she fictionalized them, of course, but she felt that they were true and realism as she knew it. And actually, Warner, in a later review of her stories, said that she was kind of in the genre of local color kind of fallen into that genre. But he said she was no more local color than Hawthorne was. Her stories were no more local color than Hawthorne's stories, because he was telling what he knew about the people around him, and he had no need to varnish them with exotic details. He was telling it as he knew it. And that's what he felt was the strength of Grace King's stories as well. The balcony stories were published by Gilda's Century company.
The Century magazine.
Right, Century magazine. They appeared there, and then in book form. There are 12 of them. They're very short, and they often have a little comeuppance for some of the characters, or, as you say, a little twist. But it's not an imposition on the story. I don't feel it flows kind of naturally from the story.
Then going back to her friendship, I know that, of course, one of the great tragedies of the Clemens' life was 1896, when their daughter Susie died in the Hartford house while they were in Europe. And there's an exchange of letters after that. I think maybe a year or two later, in
1899, December of 99. Oh, about the house, you mean? Or she doesn't write again until 1897 to Grace King, and she's still heartbroken.
Yes.
She can't find her way after Susie's death, and she feels that they shouldn't have left her. She wasn't a child to leave, she said.
That's interesting. But what I mean, of course, at the Mark Twain House, we were particularly struck by the exchange about whether they should move back to Hartford, whether they should go back into the house. And there's just two letters, one to Grace from Livy, and one back to Livy from Grace, and they just extremely moving about the kinds of things they might or might not consider in such a move.
Right. Livy remained at sea about what to do, where to go to spend out the rest of their days. She felt it would be heartbreaking to go back into the house without Susie there, and yet she didn't want to rob the other two girls of their home that they had built, their parents had built. And but well, for one thing, they wouldn't be able to afford it. She didn't want to live in the old way that they did, probably all the social activities that they attended and then had to respond in kind. She was just really at sea about it. And she asked Grace's opinion and advice. I think she was, when you write out your questions, it helps you to answer yourself a little bit. Grace King wrote back that she should go back to the house, that it was the house that they lived in, that Twain had done his wonderful work. The family had brought in all of the people that they knew, the graciousness of the house, and she felt that they might be sorry that they hadn't kept it for the girls and for themselves, but they never did go back to the house. They didn't take her advice. She was speaking out of her own experience as well, because her family had lost the house that they owned during the Civil War, and they didn't in Livy's lifetime get back to a house that they owned. It wasn't until 1904 that they owned their own home again, and her brother had bought it and put it in the three sisters' names, three remaining sisters.
Now, this was despite the fact that Grace did not have a very positive opinion of Hartford and the New Englanders, which comes out quite clearly in her early letters.
Yes, but she was very impressed with the people. She thought the city was beautiful. People were gracious. Mrs. Colt invited her to a tea. The Cheneys in South Manchester invited her to take a tour of the factory, in the silk factory, which bowled her over. She wanted to take some samples home. They were very gracious to her, and she did appreciate them. She was taken with their inviting her for herself, because she was there for the first time traveling alone. And so she was discovering that she was acceptable and desirable for herself, not just being connected to the King family as she was in New Orleans. So that was very heady stuff.
Now, do you have any favorite passages you'd like to share with us, or handy by any chance?
Well, I would like to share about Mark Twain, one of the few letters that is in here from him. She had sent him, Grace King had sent him a karat of Perique tobacco that's only grown in Louisiana.
I think
and
you have translate.
I have Perique tobacco.
A karat?
Oh, a karat, yes. So I have simulated a karat. This is what arrived. It would be 4 pounds of tobacco. And she sent this to Mark Twain and told him to cut it, to blend it with a milder tobacco. It's not to be smoked full on. But he writes back in 1888, "Dear Miss King, the handless forearm of the mummy has arrived. And if the whole mummy was as good as this fragment, he must have been the very most principal pharaoh of the very most principal dynasty, and worth the ransacking the Great Pyramid to get at the rest of him. I thank you, and also your brother, and also his friend, and do hold myself under great and special obligations to all of you. There's power in that tobacco. It makes the article which I usually smoke seem mighty characterless. I am a robust smoker and equal to 100 pipefuls of the ordinary thing in 100 consecutive quarter hours. But a single pipeful of this masculine persuader makes me want to go and curl up and take a rest, and I do it. Of course, I could modify its enthusiasm by mixing it with a base of start, but that would be to modify champagne with beer, and no truly righteous person would do that."
Well done, Mark Twain.
Yes, yes.
I have a couple of things I'll read if you will permit that. I just
Sure.
She went and visited Reverend Twitchell's wife, Harmony Twitchell, and she said, "Mrs. Twitchell is a very nice woman who has broken down suddenly in heart, principally because she has had the foolishness to undertake to bring into the world and take care of 9 children on a minister's salary." And another time she traveled with the Clemenses to New York, and she deadpans her opinion of their accommodations. She says, "The hotel rather overpowered me with the magnificence of its interior, but I soon recovered my equanimity after seeing the bedrooms and eating lunch.
Right. That was going to New York was one of the great kindnesses that Sam Clemens showed her. She wanted to dramatize her first story, Monsieur Mott, and he and Livy encouraged her to do that, to make it into a drama. And he brought her to New York with Livy and Clara, uh, and introduced her to Augustine Daly, who was an impresario in New York, to get him to read the play. And she and Daly and Twain, as her chaperone, she called him, um, sat and talked about the possibility of dramatizing her story. Daly didn't do it because he later told her in a letter that it would have required like 20 scenes, and it was, she had some good dialogue, but it wouldn't have played well. But that was a great kindness to her. He was very generous. And that was the New York hotel. It was the Murray Hill Hotel.
Mm.
She was fortunate to share a room with Clara, because otherwise the room cost like $10 a night, which was outrageous for her.
Now, you must have had a number of adventures yourself in writing this book. I ask, knowing full well that you did.
My adventures? Would you give me a hint? I don't know. It seems like I sat in the chair a lot.
Well, I mean, scholarly. You went to, you of course, you came to Hartford. You came
Oh, right.
to Watch Hill. How does Watch Hill
Right.
come into this? You've been to Cooperstown. You've been to Olana. In Olana, they have a room dedicated to Grace King, correct?
Right, right. There's a little sign there that says this room is decorated in the way that it would have been when Grace King visited with Mark Twain. She also went back again and stayed with the Churches in 1891, when the Clemenses had already left to go to Europe. She was working her way around New England again. Yes, I did follow in her footsteps, and that was wonderful. In Watch Hill, she had discovered a small community of unmarried women, and she discovered the jollification of single women. I love that word, jollification, which was good for her because she didn't expect to get married. She was already 33 when she started writing. So it was good to discover that women could enjoy each other's company and dance and talk and read, and not have to have beaux around.
And she lived that life right up. She died in 1934.
32.
32.
32. Mm-hmm.
And what was her later life like? Of course, the Clemens, Mark Twain died or Livy died in 1904. Clemens himself in 1910.
Right.
But she stayed in touch with Clara, correct?
Yes. There are a few letters from Clara, one in 1950, one in 1918, one in 1930. And she talks, and there's an announcement. There's a letter from Nina when she is born. I am born, and mother and I are well. Nina Gabrilowitz, by OG, her father. And then she writes again when Nina's 8. She says she's healthy. And then when she's 20, she's in her second year at Barnard. And the last letter from Clara is very touching, I think. It's one of the ones I often read. I sometimes close out with it, but I can read it now and then go back and talk about the girls. Grace King was not a Pied Piper type. She didn't have other young friends, so to speak. She and her brother and sisters helped raise a nephew, Carlton, but she was not that attracted to children. She was more an adult person. But she and the girls really had a terrific friendship, especially with Clara, who was so demonstrative. It would be scrumptious for Clara for Grace to come and visit. Uh, Hugs, lots of hugs and kisses and jabbering about the Shakespearean actors that she loved and telling Grace she wanted to practice the dance that Grace had taught them. I don't know what it was. And they played music together and took long walks together. And she had 53 photographs of Shakespearean actors and actresses on her wall. Clara did, and had to take them down for the summer so they didn't mildew. I guess she had them pinned onto the wall. I found that a delicious little detail.
This was in the house in Hartford, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Something that maybe should consider replicating, since we have documentary evidence now, thanks to you.
Yes. Yes, that would be interesting. I mean, if you're going to do another interpreter of a character, I would think Clara would be a great character to do. She's so alive.
Oh, you mean a historic interpreter?
Interpreter, right.
Right. We now have Susie, and we have Livy, and we have Patrick, the coachman, and Twitchell, and so on. So did you have, I'd love to hear that letter you mentioned.
Oh, okay. This is the last letter she writes. It's about a year and a few months before Grace dies. She had visited New Orleans, and her husband had visited New Orleans to play. He was a pianist, and then he became conductor of the Detroit Symphony. So they settled down in Detroit. And the last letter is, Grace, dear, I cannot tell you how your letter warmed my heart, how desperately glad I was to hear from you. I felt almost as if I had lost you out of my life. It was so long ago since I had heard from you. I long for and need a talk with you. That's not it. That's a letter from Livy, who sounds much like she always said she needed a talk with Grace. This is Clara. My dearest Grace King, do you ever think of me and the old days? I have a perfect picture in my mind of you, just the way you looked, laughed, and generally called forth the admiration of the Clemens children. I know that it's not well to dwell on the past, particularly when its most loved and vital figures have left this world. But it is nice to imagine that one still possesses some tie with old friends that one never sees anymore. Are you well? Can't you give me some news of yourself and your family? I would so love to feel the mental grip of your hand again, if we can not actually meet face to face. Osip and I are well and very busy. Nina is starting her sophomore year at Barnard College in New York. Does that not sound strange? The days, weeks, months fly fast, like pictures flashed on the windows of a rushing express train. One seems to get nothing done, and yet if one did, one would not breathe more lightly, and certainly no imprint would be left on the fickle air. I'm beginning to think the best thing is just to live, feel, smile, and nothing else.
Mm.
I
What?
like the way she's, I know, it's very touching. The pictures rushing by on the express train, I think is a
Yeah,
wonderful
yeah.
image.
So I guess that literary talent that we saw in Sam and Susie was also in Clara, obviously.
I think so. Her letters are very lively.
Well, I was there anything you wanted to add? I think that's a marvelous way to wind up, and I could invite Jennifer in here, and we could get to the questions from the audience,
Okay.
if you'd like.
Sure.
Jennifer, are you there?
Here I come.
There you are, Jennifer. Lovely.
It takes a second. Hello, everybody. Oh, Dr. Pfeffer, thank you so much. And Steve, thank you as always. One of the great joys of working at the Mark Twain House and Museum is you kind of think you know Mark Twain, you think you know a lot, and then you learn all the time. And so we're grateful to you. I just want to point out that a number of our historic interpreters are in the audience tonight, as usual. And they're loving it too. So thank you on the entire staff and board for doing this. We also have a lot of our, Mark Twain Circle friends out there. And it's just been really lovely to gather with all of these Mark Twain loving people every couple of weeks to talk about Twain related things. So thank you for doing this. We do have some questions and I will jump right in. Our good friend Kevin MacDonald wants to say, and this one got 5 votes, so Kevin's not alone in wanting to know about this. Everybody loves a sex scandal. Can you comment on Grace King's reaction to Warner's mistress who lived in his household and the circumstances of his death? Take it away, Dr. Pfeffer.
I didn't call her his mistress, though Grace King did tell her family that Isa Cabell was his Mrs. West, who was someone her uncle apparently had this paramour. But Isa moved into the house and kind of took over. And Grace and Isa were there at the same time, and there was gossip inside the house from Annie Price, who was a member of the family and kind of ran the household, I guess, and Grace, but it was kind of just hinted at. Grace was New Orleans is a sexual city, and it's an open city, and she knew things that she saw, and I can't tell you more than the letters do. That's all I know. Everything that's in the book from the letters is all that I know. Now, about his death, another thing that she and her family talked about was how when Warner came to New Orleans, he always stayed at a men's only boarding house, and usually run by a free woman of color. And the houseboy once reported that he saw him in a biracial saloon. I don't think I put that letter in there. Not that I was trying to hide it. It was just, one of those things. But they talked about, they kind of gossiped in the family probably about his proclivities when he was in New Orleans, how his preferences. And so when he died, he had supposedly taken a long walk and ended up in the house of a woman of mixed race and died there. Does that answer your question, kind of, sort of?
Well, it was
teaser, you have to read them.
Well, Kevin, will you let us know in the chat if that did the trick for you?
Twitchell and Twain gossiped about that same woman. Little hints, right?
Yeah, in their letters, they didn't really gossip about her as much as they what do we call it? They they acted
Mansplained her.
they acted like seventh grade boys
Oh,
gossiping about a girl they didn't like. It
oh.
was however, Jean's diary mentions that at Warner's funeral, Ms. Cabell was acting like the widow, and which scandalized Mrs. Warner. We're actually had a few guests looking around in Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford the other day, where Warner is buried, and I do a little tour there with the Cedar Hill Foundation. Usually, not this year. But I showed the friends Warner's grave, and in 1925, when Ms. Issa Cabell died, she made sure she was buried right next to him. So,
But she died in New York, right? So she had to be moved to Hartford to be buried there.
it was obviously an intentional move. And what the background is, I don't know. We could look at the letters of Charles Dudley Warner, but they're completely illegible. And
I think purposely.
This is how we met in the first place. Now, at the Mark Twain papers, they call him Charles Deadly Warner because, and you worked in the papers too. I'm interrupting our guests' questions.
Okay, sorry.
But you did get a lot of help from the papers too, because they had to sort of give you the imprimatur on publishing Clemens letters, correct?
Clara's letters, yes.
Clara's letters.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well,
Okay.
Kevin says that'll fetch him and make him buy the book. So now there is a link for making that purchase right there in the chat section. That was not staged. That was not a setup in any way.
Thanks, Kevin.
Let's see. There's so many good ones. This is from Susan K. Harris, who's going to be our next Trouble at Home speaker, right, Steve?
Yes, I was going to give a little plug for that, and I'll take the opportunity now that Susan, who's a wonderful Mark Twain scholar, has written on the Sam and Livy, and has written on Mark Twain and imperialism. She just completed and published a book in the spring of her own travels to Australia, India, and South Africa, following in the footsteps of Following the Equator, which is the third great travel book, the book that he wrote toward the end of his life in the 1890s. It's called Mark Twain, The World and Me, Following the Equator Then and Now, and it blends history, biography, literary criticism. And she will be interviewed by Jody DeBrine, who is our director of collections, and is just loves travel herself, and is a dynamite person to be the interviewer next time. A little plug, that's 2 weeks from now, of course, which is August, am I right, it's the 6th? Again at 5:30 Eastern time. Let's get back to the questions, though. What did Susan ask?
So Susan asked, can Miki talk about her editing process?
Oh, yeah. Well, I pulled all of the complete letters from and to Grace King and the Clemenses. I knew that I wanted that to be the base. And I tried to show in excerpts from other letters before and after that Grace's development as a writer and how she fit in to the Clemenses, and how she developed as a business person, and a writer. And so it's the rest of the narrative is a connecting narrative. It's kind of like a collage of little pieces of letters that are pertinent to telling who she is and where she's going in her writing.
Thank you for that.
It's hard to say exactly how you do it because it's a process, and you put things in, you take things out, you fill holes. But I didn't want it to just be a volume of letters. I wanted it to be a story that encompasses the letters.
Makes sense. Thank you. Another of our stalwart regular friends, Walter Powell, he says, in 1887, Union veterans groups were getting increasingly active in commemorating the Civil War, especially at Gettysburg, at the same time that the United Daughters of the Confederacy were promoting the Lost Cause. Without the benefit yet of having read her letters, this is Walter, what do you know of Grace's political views?
She was very much a daughter of the South, not a, some people have called her unreconstructed. She thought that she was a states' rights person. She thought the Yankees and the Republicans had imposed themselves on, especially during Reconstruction. So she was very much opposed to federal intrusion. But, the South had lost, really. In her writing, she felt that she was showing how love, especially among women in the Reconstruction period, was what would bring people together rather than an imposition of laws and federal imposition of Reconstruction. She was definitely a Democrat. She was anti-lottery. She was thrilled when Mark Twain went and voted Democrat when she was there in 1888. I think it was that trip. She spent a month there, and he voted for Cleveland and not for Harrison.
Yeah. And I mean, as far as her racial attitudes, you can, in her stories, do involve people of color.
But they do have an agency. The women of color in her stories have agency. They're not victims. I think that was part of her writing against Cable, because in some of his stories, the women of color seem victimized, and he's watching them from a distance. Her stories are closer to the people that she's writing about, and they're not without agency.
Cable being the author who ultimately went on a famous lecture tour with Mark Twain, the writer of stories about the Creole peoples of Louisiana, and who ended up living in Northampton because he was not popular in the South, Northampton, Mass.
Right. He was persona non grata after his essay on the freedmen in equity, especially that, and his stories. It was a complicated relation to race relations. I wouldn't say she struggled as Twain did, but not a simple thing. And New Orleans had already been a city, not a biracial city, but at least a triracial city with a range of people of color. There's a whole community of free people of color who could navigate certain areas in New Orleans.
Okay.
One of our, maybe two more questions. Does that work for you too?
Sure.
One of our wonderful historic interpreters, Josh, wants to know, did Grace King have any influence on Mark Twain's writing?
Oh, I doubt it. I doubt it. Although he felt she was not a mar on his writing. He told us she was an inspiration. I don't know what he meant by that. I have no idea. I doubt that she had influence on his writing. They had long talks, I know. She stayed with them a full month in 88 and then visited them almost a month in Florence in 1892. And it's obvious they had long talks and felt comfortable about whatever conversations they were having and interacting. And when Livy invited Grace King to come and stay with them in the month of October in 88, she said, "Be assured that you will not be in the way." And Twain confirmed that, because if it had been male visitors, he might have felt he had to entertain them. But with Grace King, she was writing, he was writing, and she would not interfere with what he needed to do.
Yeah, that might have been, this is more or less, I think, the quote you gave, but I had written it down previously when Livy was writing, encouraging her to visit. Maybe Grace had said, "I don't want to interrupt Mark's work," and Livy wrote back that he did not consider King a mar to my work, but an inspiration, as you just said. And I think that might have been the context. And I think in a way, I mean, when he spoke to anyone at great length, they were an inspiration. He loved to learn stuff, and he was an endless note taker. And I think her perspective, especially in Puritan New England, was probably incredibly refreshing and different. Anyway,
Right. And he could relate to what she was saying, I'm sure, whether he agreed with her view or not. He knew where she was coming from.
Awesome. And then Linda Bryan wants to know, Dr. Pfeffer, is there anything that you weren't able to uncover about Grace King that you wish you could find out about her? And what, if so, what?
There are a lot of letters there. I haven't felt a hole yet that I didn't get from her. I wish that the Clemenses had saved her letters. There are many letters to Grace at LSU that the letter is not in the Mark Twain Project at Berkeley. And so I don't know, they got lost along the way. I wish I knew what she had written to them as much as what they had written to her. I still am transcribing the letters. There are hundreds and hundreds of letters. I still haven't transcribed certain years, like past 1910. I'm doing World War One and into those years, pestilences, plagues, and wars, epidemics, pandemics, the Spanish flu, etc. So there's still a lot to do. And each letter is a page turner for me. There's always some wonderful nugget in there that I'm not expecting.
So are you saying, will there be another volume? Are you working on another volume?
I would like another volume to come out. If enough of this volume sell, the LSU press, I'm sure will be more open to a second volume. The editor is open to it, but my previous editor, she's gone on to another role now, so she doesn't have authority where she did before.
Well, again, that was not a plant, but hint, hint, folks, buy the book.
Oh, goodness.
Oh, well, oh my goodness. Our friend Marilyn Aiken says, thank you. Dinner won't fix itself. Thank you, Miki. So I think it's being suggested that people are getting...
Someone, you ready to go, huh?
They're ready to go. That's fine.
No, that's all the comments have been about how wonderful an evening this has been and how everybody's enjoyed this so much. And I have to second that, and I know Steve will as well. And of course, Steve, you're part of what makes it so wonderful. Either of you have anything you'd like to say before we part ways for the evening?
Miki?
I will go off and think of all the wonderful things I should have said and could have said and didn't say. Beat myself up about that.
Don't worry about that at all. And I'll just encourage you again to come back here in 2 weeks at 5:30 Eastern Daylight Time, and you will hear Susan Harris talking about strange and exotic parts of the world and Mark Twain. 5:30, August 6th.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to seeing you there.
Happy dinner, everyone.
Yes, enjoy your dinners.
What were you going to say? I'm sorry. Intruded.
I was going to say, just add one thing. You mentioned you're going to review and then think of all the things. One of the great things about these crowdcasts is that you can come back and watch the recording, and the chat remains active. So that if you should think of something, I'm not suggesting you should or need to do this, but if you thought of something you wanted to correct or add or whatever, you can actually come back into the chat and add something.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
And people do actually come back and check. So just a little something to keep in mind.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you for telling me.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this. So interesting. Such a great evening. And I'm really glad to have made your acquaintance personally. And
likewise.
Spending our evening together. And Steve, thank you as always.
Thank you, Jennifer, as always. And thank you, Miki. It's always nice to talk to you.
Likewise.
All right. Well, I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.